All right, then I guess we can get started. And thank you everyone for attending today's session on the Gaming Guild. This is the last one for Kernel Block 4, and most of the time, what we do with the Gaming Guild is we end the discussions on infinite games, which I think also mirrors a bit what the Kernel Learn track does when around this time, where in the last module we had was about scaling infinitely principled games. And I think it's a good segue into infinite games in gaming, I guess in the video gaming space in particular. But I think what we've come to see, at least what I've come to see across the kernel blocks and being part of Web3 is it seems like games, and it's becoming more nebulous whether we're making video games or like games in general, the games we play. And so I think it's good for us to have Simon here, who I think has a very good perspective on how games fit not just in Web3 but in our lives, in particular in the video games that we play. And of course Andy, who has been the one who actually is the kernel of all this learning that we're taking part of. It would be good to kind of discuss with each other how we see infinite games, and maybe how we can move forward after all that we've learned here in the kernel gaming track. And I guess I want to start, of course, with just for Simon's benefit again, who the kernel folks are. So it's a very diverse group of builders in Web3, and not just builders. I would say that we do have engineers from companies like Apple, Facebook, and Google. But more importantly, I think people who join kernel provide us the diverse perspectives that we need in Web3. Um, for example, we have three-dimensional humans like Buddhist monks and New York Times bestseller musicians, which I feel in particular in the games industry, we've become less and less diverse. So I think in Web3 we need these kinds of perspectives to really grow, to really change the systems, I guess, that we're used to running. And I would also want to do a bit of a shout out to the people in the Kernel Gaming Guild. So I feel that the Kernel Gaming Guild participants will be the ones creating the future games of Web3. For example, we have Justin Gleibert, who is part of OX Park, who is also advising Dark Forest. We have Andre of JS13K Games, who is moving from Web 2 to Web 3. And we have the on-chain game developers like Ronan making Conquest ETH and Eternal. But aside from that, as I mentioned, we see that people are building not just video games, but even I think role-playing games. For example, video games. Some people are working on VR with OpenDive and Body Gallery, and some new kinds of games like Ryan's Crypto Raiders. So this is, I feel, the group of people who will be defining what games in Web3 will become. So yes, I'm hoping this discussion will add a bit more to how they think about games and infinite games in particular. And with that, I guess I want to welcome Simon. And I was hoping, Andy, that maybe you could do the introduction of Simon for us. I know a bit about Simon's work, but I know you guys have known each other for longer. And yeah, I pass it off to you, Andy.
I love doing this. I could talk about Simon for the whole guild. In fact, maybe we could just sit and wait. Simon is a dear friend. In fact, the first person that I met in real life in Bitcoin at the time. We met in a bar in Cape Town many years ago. He has since gone on to do all sorts of interesting things in the Ethereum ecosystem, from helping extensively with the ERC20 token standard to coming up with token curated registries, bonding curves, curation markets, continuous funding models. He's written his own novel. It's incredible. Hope Runners of Good Luck. Go and read it. There's art associated with it. He's done all sorts of cool NFT projects. This artwork is always on sale. This artwork is always on sale V2. This artwork is always on sale V2 restored. There are any number of artifacts left on the Ethereum chain from Simon's work, including stories, which have been excavated recently by NFT archaeologists. He's not only been involved with Ethereum, he was coding on Bitcoin before it was cool. He took a year off once upon a time, entirely funded by Dogecoin before Elon Musk knew about it. He actually is Elon Musk, surprisingly. That's a little known fact about Siwan. And he's drinking out of a cup which has nothing to do with some random French artist, but in fact symbolizes one of his cooler NFT projects called Neolastics, which combines NFTs, bonding curves, and a lot of his thinking in this particular regard, which goes very deep, it goes very wide, it is composable, iterable, and if you want to really know about Lego blocks for building better webs, then he's your man. So,
Cool.
we're getting better
Thank you,
each time,
Andy.
I feel.
Yeah, and I guess Simon, maybe if you wanted to say a few words of introduction, also.
I mean, I feel like I need to be my personal hype man. I always really appreciate the words, Andy. Thank you for that introduction. Appreciate it. I don't think I have any more to add. You've done more than enough. So thanks.
All right, yeah, and yeah, so I sent over a few links that people can start as a reading list, but I guess the core of the discussion will be more around infinite games, and so I'll just use this slide to kind of guide our discussion. So I guess one thing I wanted to ask you, Simone and Andy, is about finite and infinite games, and maybe how you found it. For example, I've been a game developer for a while, and I think if you're serious in game design, you would naturally come across what Dr. Kars has written, specifically around around if you wanna know what games are, and you go back even before video games, people have been thinking about games, and I think Dr. Kars has kind of distilled it down to one of its fundamentals, right? That there are at least two kinds of games. One is finite and the other infinite. And the infinite game is played for the purpose of winning, and or a finite game is played for the purpose of winning, but an infinite game is for the purpose of continuing the play. So yeah, I'm curious, Simone, like what was the story behind you discovering finite and infinite games, and I guess how it kind of affects how you think about the work that you do.
Yeah, it's a good question. I did do game design at some point. I made games when I was in high school. But I don't think I came upon his work through game design, really. I think it's more like because the term game can also be referred to or be used as just a way to describe a rules-based system, right? And in our sort of in our society, we all like interact and communicate with various rules, some more explicit, some implicit, some social norms, and then you've got legitimate like full games, which is like sports or video gaming. And to me, I think I came or discovered his work more from a philosophical perspective, and I felt like when I found the work, it kind of like enshrined a sort of underlying belief I had, but he gave me new tools to describe it, right? Which is this feeling of like, why was I feeling some kind of discontent towards certain systems, and why was I gravitating towards other systems? And James Carr's, the way he describes it to me, felt like this was a great language to describe how I felt about certain systems or not. It's like it describes why, I discovered blockchains in the first place and why I was excited about it, because it enshrined this idea of infinite play more directly within the rules. So it came from just more like a philosophical perspective and found it. And the rest of the book as well, it touches on various aspects of finite games, but I think the sort of the core underlying thing that I took from it, and I think this is why I found it. I think I was there was a period where I was reading a lot on play, and play as a metaphor, or play as the thing that people do. Like, why do people play? How do they play? And this was one of the things that came up. was the purpose of play. Why do we play? And yeah, that's how I found the book.
Cool, yeah. And maybe Andy, I was hoping to ask you also, like Infinite Games is also a part of the kernel learn track, right? It's specifically how do we scale scaling principled games infinitely. So maybe there's something you wanted to add on how you found that, or maybe something more to add to what Simon said.
Well, I found it through Simon's writing, as with kind of everything that I know about blockchains. And I had my own interest in play that had stemmed primarily from a linguistic perspective, as you so beautifully discussed on this slide. I think that I had become interested in terms of like a play on words, and then falling further and further down into this notion of play, not necessarily as something even purposeful, but as autopoetic act, as something done for its own sake. And I think that in the context of your question, that kind of is what shines through the most for me, right? Is that often when people talk about scale, it is as a way of abstracting themselves from whatever system they're building, and therefore removing their own personal responsibility, right? It's like you can't be intimately involved with every single aspect of the community that you're building in order for the community to scale, is often the way that the argument is kind of put forward. And while that has some practical truth in it, it's not possible for instance, Vivek and I to interface one-on-one with every single kernel fellow if there are a million kernel fellows. I think that this particular insight into play done for its own sake is in fact what leads to the kind of infinity that Cass is really talking about. It's not infinite scale where you dominate, control, possess, or make accessible and understandable and legible the whole world. It is the kind of infinity which comes from people living in a way which is not for some external purpose, not for some external motivation, but which is deeply and intrinsically an expression of who they are, right? This notion of language is a really, really interesting one, because it reminds me of a very specific part of the kernel syllabus, which is not in the Learn track specifically, but is in the conversation tab. And in interacting with the Griqua, which are a tribe of the so-called first people in South Africa, Paul Myberg wrote this. He said, "There is also a delightful and trusting open-endedness in every story or narrative. It reflects the deep certainty that everything can pause, hold for a while, and then continue as a living narrative when it is time. This propensity allows for an instinctual response to living in a moving, changing world, a life that demands this flexibility in order to adapt and sustain. Language is expressed from the innate nature of the being, and the way that one speaks oneself into the world is the way that one lives oneself into the world." That scale for me, right? And it is what both allows me to be deeply entangled, responsible for, and accountable to the things that I create and am a part of, without them necessarily just having to depend on me. Because what it really is about, what these infinite games are about in some way, is giving people the tools to like write your own part of the story. You know, that's what SCP and Life of Norman and all these things are doing. It's like, here are the rules. The way that we set up the game is such that you actually end up playing with the rules rather than just within them. Like, go and do it. You know, bugger off and leave me alone. I want to sit and listen to the birds, you know, swim in the ocean, and occasionally appear on the screen. Yeah.
But yeah, thank you, Andy. And I guess for other people's benefit also, you mentioned SCP, and I was hoping, Simon, for you to tell us a little bit about SCP, because I've seen you talk about it also in your blog post.
Yeah, ACP. So ACP stands for Secure, Contain, Protect, and it's a creative collaborative writing exercise on the internet. You can go, if you Google ACP Wiki, you can find everything that's been written there. But I found ACP to be quite interesting because it enshrined to me the principles of infinite games in storytelling. So there was this period where I was doing a bunch of research because I was writing fiction, and I couldn't find anything people were using to reference finite or infinite games in terms of storytelling. And so I tried matching the two things together and see if this stuff exists with this mental model. And so I found ACP to be a good example of it. And what ACP is there's this belief that in our current world, there's a lot of anomalies, like strange things that happen around the edge of our visible world. You know, the corner alien or the ghost in the hotel, you know, that kind of feeling that there's always this other world around us. And what people do in ACP, they capture these things in the real world and then they invent stories about them. So they would say, here's the strange thing that happened in my neighborhood. I'm going to invent a story. So it's not conspiracy theories. It's nothing related to the real world. It's like they're inventing worlds. They're inventing, this is an alien from this planet, and it's a class C threat level to humanity. And so over time, ACP started inventing these stories about strange things that happen in our world, and people started riffing off each other. They started creating these agencies, and then like these strange paradoxical things that happen, and playing off each other and creating all these Wikipedia entries of anomalies. And yes, Sachin, I think that should be the wiki for it. But what was just interesting to me about it was like the principles of infinite play is to infinite play or infinite games is to continue the play, and in this case, that's what ACP felt as a storytelling exercise. It was people would only participate or continue to participate if it was constantly novel, it was constantly a surprise. And something Andy mentioned as well, where you play with the rules. ACP also plays with the boundaries. Also, between there are certain circumstances where someone's stories involves actual people with the ACP. So it's like maybe the ACP is actually real, and we are just like capturing this as a creative writing exercise. And so there's like a lot of play in between the boundaries and the rules and how they're inventing this stuff together. So to me, it was like a great model just to look at like how they created this world. And I think Andy mentioned also other ones that I found. This is called Life of Norman, where people write, it's a subreddit where people co-write stories about a completely unremarkable man called Norman. And people just invent these stories about him, but it's like extremely mundane. And it has this very calming effect. So it's not like the traditional conflict narratives you find in, say, Marvel movies or whatever. It's just like this man went to the store and bought some soda. That's the story. And then Have We Met is also an interesting one where people, it's in a subreddit where they pretend to know each other. So it creates a sense of community, and there's no obligation to even even get to the awkward level of meeting someone new. It's just like, we all know each other. This is great. We're all from a fictional town that knows each other. So that was like a good example of like enshrining the principle of infinite games to storytelling.
That's super cool, yeah. And I think there's a lot to learn there from what the blockchain developers are trying to do. I think all of us are familiar with the Loot project, for example. I think that was something that resonated with a lot of developers. Like, how can we build infinite games on top of this? And I don't think we found the correct answer there yet. I think I guess that the Loot project, I feel, was limited a bit by how the economics were designed or not designed. So I think there's things to learn from these infinite storytelling, and I guess infinite games in particular. There's a lot of overlap there. And I guess also I wanted to go to the next slide, Simone. Oops, sorry, I'm moving this. But yeah, something that you've also touched on in your blog post is the hero's journey. And I myself, I think I've seen this a lot also, particularly when I try to write like blog posts. I always remember the similar, I guess it's a callback to the hero's journey by Campbell, but the writer of Rick and Morty, Dan Harmon, I think this is his version, which is I guess a more
Story
simpler one.
circle, yeah.
Yeah, the story circle, but it's but they kind of follow the same template, right? And I think we discussed this also, Andy, with Rushkoff, right, where he says that the hero's journey was an old template, and now that the world is a bit more complicated, that it doesn't work as much. And yeah, and I guess in terms of the hero's journey and how it fits in the infinite game, in making infinite games, I would want to hear both of your thoughts on that, and how do you think about the hero's journey, and what led you to I guess to read about it, Simon.
Yeah, I can start there. Um, yeah, this is a template that you find when you start getting into storytelling and just reading up on the theory of storytelling and where it comes from. There was this I can't recall who initially shared this with me, but I found it to be an interesting way to think about stories. Is that stories often masquerade as lessons, and um, the hero's journey is probably like one of the most classic templates of storytelling, because it shares lessons to society, to people and society and communities. It's the classic idea of the journey, or the maybe more in earlier times, the idea of the adventure and the hunt. And that it's still a template that's extremely popular. I think I would probably say more than 95% of what you see in like that highest grossing films all follow similar formats, that still follow this HL format. But in terms of like infinite games, what I found with this principle or idea is that it fit into the narrative of conflict. It's a very conflict driven storytelling, but it's not that conflict isn't bad. It's more so conflict as challenge, right? So it writes stories based on challenges that we have to face to learn in order to live in the world. And what I found in terms of trying to compare this kind of story model to infinite games and infinite storytelling was that what resonated with me was this quote by E.B. White, which said, "On some mornings, I wake up and I'm torn between saving the world and savoring the world." And I feel like conflict narratives and hero's journey narratives teach us how to save the world. It teaches us how to like just exist as a society together, how to like conquer the challenges that we have. But it's still ultimately this very conflict driven narrative of like we have to overcome. There's these challenges that we have to face. We have to conquer. We have to win. That fit very much into the finite game narrative, which is finite games require winners, finite games require losers, right? And so for me, in infinite storytelling, the comparison is not to save the world, but to savor the world. And that's where also the principle of play comes in. To me, play is primarily about savoring the world, even though it teaches lessons as well. Play is important for learning, but it's still primarily about savoring the world. And so I read a bunch of examples of like how I related to that year's journey to infinite game storytelling. Um, it's somewhere in the blog post that I wrote, but um, it's a bit longer now. I could probably share more specific stuff, but ultimately, I think what's more interesting is that because this formula is very successful, it's there for a reason, and that's why a lot of finite games exist in the world. Is because it is in some way necessary for our survival, but we do things that are more than our mere survival, right? We play, we experience awe, we have various emotions and things like that. So ultimately, this is a template within a more specific model of finite games, and that's why I find infinite games, infinite story more interesting, just because it feels less explored. That being said, I don't think in humanity's past that this was always the case. I feel like stories, before we were able to write them down, was actually infinite stories. It was about, the story would only succeed if you did actually tell it, right? You had to share it. You had to participate in this belief that stories create abundance. So now that with the internet and everything coming around, and we're going to more into an era of abundance, I feel like infinite stories, infinite storytellings is more important. So hopefully that gives like a good background. Here's what Annie has to say.
It's an incredible answer. Jake has asked, would you consider the hero's journey inherently finite because it is a framework revolving around some form of resolution to the story?
Yes,
and
that is. Oh, sorry, Andy. Sorry,
please
sorry.
carry
If you wanted to, I wasn't sure if you were asking that question to me or whether you wanted to answer that question. But there is something too about what I felt about finite stories is that a finite story still, as exactly as you described, Jake, it's like it is based on the premise that a story has a beginning and an end, and it asks the reader to escape themselves from the story, escape themselves into the story and experience that beginning and experience their end. And so sometimes in most of finite stories, there is likely probably winners and losers, but whether that's against other people, against man, or against nature, against environment, against God, against everything else, but there's this feeling in the hero's journey of like conquer, a winner and a loser, a beginning and an end, a resolution, a change, a synthesis, whereas infinite games, infinite storytellings at least, aspire to not have an end. The goal is to use story to attract people and players. Yeah. Sorry, Andy, I interrupted you. Please continue.
No, that's perfect. It's really interesting to me, right? Because what infinite games are pointing to is how unnecessary elements can be used to continuously engender surprise and therefore play with this notion of escapism that Simon has just mentioned and are sort of self-aware about it in SCP. SCP-001 is this anomaly about anomalies, and there's this playing of the boundaries that we've already talked about. But, like, Jake, if you know a bit more about Joseph Campbell, you will know that he was a professor of comparative religion, and he came to the Hero of a Thousand Faces, which is where this particular narrative arc is described, through many other books. My favorite one is Myths to Live By, which I think is sensational. And the core of his work was looking at all of the different myths across various different cultures, whether it was Native American, South American, all across Europe, various different African tribes, Polynesian stories, and finding kind of similarities and differences and using this to create some kind of coherent narrative structure. And then we accept that narrative structure as necessarily implying beginning and end, conflict with the world, all of these things which Simon has very beautifully and very accurately described, because that's how Campbell talks about it. But if you think about like the wider context of his work and you look at these actual myths themselves, including, the Christian religious myths and various Abrahamic myths that he was looking at, as well as the stories from all of the different indigenous cultures that he considers in creating this particular framework, none of them have an end. Right? What is the end of the Bible? There is no end, right? It kind of, there's some really crazy stuff which happens in Revelations. Wonderful. If you want a wild ride, go and read Revelations. It's really something. But the point there being that I don't think that it is inherently finite. I think that's what any story is asking you is, do you have the sincerity and creativity to make of this your own infinite game, to integrate whatever is happening in the total living flow of your own life? Like, this is not to say that there aren't like finite stories with which it is very difficult to do that kind of thing, and you'll be bending over backwards and doing all sorts of strange intellectual gymnastics. But I think that, like, at a deeper level, no story is necessarily inherently finite, except, like, generally speaking, modern Western stories post the Industrial Revolution in particular. And a great reference for this, perhaps, is an American writer called Kurt Vonnegut, who gave an incredible lecture towards the end of his life called The Shape of Stories. And it's really quite sensational, I think, because he goes through many different narrative arcs in a similar way to what Douglas Rushkoff does in the Kernel syllabus, illustrating how, you know, this kind of circle that you see on the screen now can also be like drawn on an X and Y axis in various different sort of ups and downs using Cinderella and other stories. And then he kind of, in the beginning, he mentions in what seems at first to be like a fairly disparaging way, indigenous story, where like kind of nothing ever happens. You know, the person begins here and kind of ends in the same place. And it's just all these like little steps along the same line in between. And he's sort of like, he's like, you know, that was clearly rubbish. And he moves into Western stories. And then he goes back and he considers Hamlet, and he draws the line for Hamlet. Hamlet kind of begins a little bit depressed, and then some like kind of good stuff happens and some kind of bad stuff happens, and then he stabs some dude behind the curtain and, you know, questions fates and outrageous fortune and all this kind of stuff, and it kind of ends up in exactly the same place. And he's like, oh my god, you know, like this is the same flatline sort of indigenous story. And I think that that's also what Simon was gesturing at, is that you can have these kinds of narrative arcs within like wider stories. You know, the Greek writer I mentioned earlier, like they would tell stories to each other around campfires each night as a part of the narrative machinery of the universe. Literally, if you didn't tell the stories, the sun was unlikely to rise the next morning. You know, it was the stories that kept things turning, that kind of success that Simon talked about. And they kept things turning because there was a baseline to them, that this circle was never escaped, that it was exactly what it actually looks like, which is just a circle, not something with a break in it. So all of my work, the reason that I tell you about all of my academic work was precisely about like how we read. And if we are able to read sincerely, we can find the singularity of each work, which is to say we can find the infinite within any finite story. And that seems to me like a worthwhile endeavor as a reader. I know that doesn't necessarily help game designers who are equivalent to writers in this particular conversation, but it's worth considering. You know, like Paul has this really great example of people role-playing in GTA 5, right? They're not actually kind of like playing GTA, but they're using the GTA environments to do LARPing, which is amazing, I think. And that speaks to how finite stories can be co-opted in these really, really interesting ways. And to me, it's just a question of like, are you writing a story which is self-aware about the fact that it can be co-opted, or are you trying to act against that in an inevitably futile way?
So that was actually going to be kind of one of my follow-up questions there, which was, do you have to approach the narrative in a different way for it to become an infinite game? And so I guess you're saying it can go either way. You can be building a finite game that, you know, the community ends up making infinite in its own way, or you can approach it, you know, in a very thoughtful and systematic way to make it infinite.
I'll answer very, very briefly because I know Simon has some things which he would want to add. One of my favorite authors is J.R.R. Tolkien, and Tolkien used to speak about the difference between allegory and applicability. He said there were two different kinds of authors, those of allegory and those of applicability. The allegory lies in the purposed domination of the author, the applicability in the interpretive freedom of the reader. So when I, as an author, assume that I am intelligent enough to create an allegorical structure in which I can say this equals that, this equals that, this equals that, and there's like a clear trail through it that leads you to one specific and so-called right answer. That's the purpose domination of the author, right? And it comes from a particular kind of egoistic, hubristic notion of I am the author, right? Whereas authors of applicability are being honest, clear, and creative about describing their own particular experience in such a way that others can find mirrored in that particularity some universal essence. This is why fairy tales and others were such a big part of Tolkien's work, because he said, truly told, fairy tales provide us with a door onto other time, capital O, capital T. And in that applicability, you find the same notion of infinity, right? That what you're trying to do as a game designer, or as a writer, or as any kind of creative, in fact, is find the applicable. And what that really means is kill who you think you are. I mean, others would put it in a less blunt fashion, but I honestly think that that's what it's about, right? Is that you have to create from a place where it's not you doing it, it's flowing through you. And to really cultivate that kind of capacity takes a great deal of intention and awareness and practice. So.
I think it's a good question about like the designing this sort of difference between finite and infinite games. I feel like by nature, infinite games is sort of more permissionless. Sorry, it's more permissionless. So you can set up things to invite play from others, right? But it's just like you're setting the stage, right? And others can come into play. Like a good example of that in practical terms. So for the stuff that I'm doing with Untitled Frontier, for example, we're writing short stories, right? And these short stories, it's very classic hero's journey short stories, right? But each short story, once it's written, right, the IP of the short story and IP of the NFTs are permissive. It's CC0. You're allowed to do anything. So by setting that open, by creating that open boundary or border, you invite people to do anything what they wish to do. So in that sense, like the infinite game in that context is like you've merely set the stage and people can come in to participate however they wish or however they want to. But you know, SCP is a good example where the rules to invite people are very clear, right? The wiki page is a very obvious way to play, right? It's like create a wiki page about an anomaly. You go about your world, you see something weird, write a wiki page. It's like very straightforward way to invite play. If it's just, hey, all the IP is permissively licensed, people still don't know, okay, sure, I guess I can play in any way I want, but maybe give me a bit more constraints to play in like more fun ways. I feel like one other way infinite games also emerge sometimes is, especially in the gaming world, in competitive gaming, is that competitive gaming is a very clear example of a finite game. There's a winner and a loser. You require audience and spectators to believe that someone won. There's rewards. It's like a very classic conquer, winner, loser thing. You know, if you watch Dota, League of Legends, Super Smash Bros, whatever. But almost all competitive games have this concept called the meta, right? It's like what is the outside of these finite games that is constantly being played, right? It's just like, what is the character? What's the new characters that are suddenly good? Like, what are the rankings of the characters? Top tier, S tier characters, or like, you know, what team setups are these? What strategies are always changing? Like, who are the new entrants into the competitive gaming space? And that the meta is designed as is emerged as infinite game because that's it. You want people to come in to participate. The game community wants to play all these finite games, but they want more people to come participate to play the game because people love these good stories. They love, like, you know, I love Super Smash Brothers and I follow the competitive gaming Super Smash Brothers, and there's this new person that came on the scene in 2020, Spargo, and like he's suddenly this very great player, 15 years old, and suddenly starts upsetting in all the major competitive gaming events, and that's great for the meta. You know, it gets people interested, gets people playing, and so in terms of like, it's and you also said it's not that finite things is better over infinite things or infinite things better over finite things. I think this is sort of a framework for thinking about how to play, especially game design. So I think that's like a good example to me. Sometimes infinite games or infinite storytelling happens by accident, but you can engender it, you can foster it, you can invite people, you can set ways for people to participate in an infinite manner.
So do you feel that infinite games are more about the evolution of how the game is played, in that a meta is, you have this very clear framework, the rules are the same, there's just a constantly changing way of the best or, you know, most optimized way of playing it, versus, I guess, like if I think of, say, like a World of Warcraft or a game that constantly has additional DLC and they just keep adding more content onto the game, and, you know, the line is very, very similar in terms of how you're actually playing. Would you consider kind of both of those different types of infinite games, or the former, more potent form of it?
Yeah, I think it can be its own spectrum too. Like, the concept or idea of in something like the meta of a competitive game, it's still very much engineered by the gaming company itself. So there are still boundaries there that you can't cross. Like, it's going to be probably pretty hard to like fork the game and like make your own game of it, because it's all closed source IP, for example. To the other extreme, which is the most infinite, like nebulous form of infinite games or infinite play or infinite storytelling, is just like literally inventing stories about the world around you. It's just like this shared narrative of play, right? It sounds very vague because that's what it is. It's like very nebulous. It's like it's this belief of the world is something to play with at every level, in every space, in every way. So I think it's a spectrum, but it's all a good question. For me, it's a very great, like also what I initially found, it's a very great framework to understand the kinds of systems that we design, whether they are video games, whether they are stories that we tell, whether it's actually blockchains too. You can also think about blockchains differently. There are some blockchains that more foster infinite participation, like Ethereum, by nature of choosing a Turing complete language as part of its baseline, invites play more than, say, Bitcoin, which is more restricted scripting language, for example.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to add there that that discussion on meta, Simone, I'm reminded of someone saying, I don't remember where, but like if a meta is solved, then that means that the game is dead. That there's nothing to be able to balance anymore, right? So it's gonna become boring. Eventually, people will leave. So the meta has to be a bit broken for people to find ways to engage with it more and bring more users, as you mentioned. So I think it's very relevant. And I guess I want to go through two more slides to just finish these points that I've prepared. But one is, I know you've been looking at a lot of ways to bring systems on chain, Simone, and I think that's something we've been thinking about, is how can we put like the game design on chain, and specifically maybe creating an infinite game on chain. Like I mentioned, the Loot project, right? That's something like people can build on. DeFi, I think, was a perfect example of how we should strive to build our systems, wherein things can be put together in like maybe infinite ways for us to create new systems. And some games have been trying to do this in some systems, like you've given the Ava Stars example, which is everything for the avatar is on chain. And I shared some of the games made by the Kernel Gaming Guild participants also, like Eternal, made by Ronan, wherein the whole game was on chain. You discover maps as you play the game on chain, but because of gas, that didn't succeed as well as it would have. And the other was the DAO, made by Austin Griffith, wherein the game was all about being part of a DAO, wherein it's similar to Catan. I would say you're trading resources and there's an end game. But as part of the DAO, you're kind of also voting on the rules. So the rules change as you play the game. So I think blockchain, because of the nature of it, also allows us to do certain things differently. And I myself feel that as a game designer, it might even be a weak spot for me, that I look at games from a video game designer's perspective, that I would like, where my mind goes to is to design a game like Axie Infinity, right? Where it's like Pokemon and it's play to earn. But is there some other way that we could think about it? I would say, like, how would you think about making games on chain or storytelling on chain, or how can we make these infinite?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's something that I think everyone is exploring at the moment. And I think I still think like Loot is to me still one of my favorite examples, because it's not that people weren't invited to invent things based on what exists in the blockchain. It's just that Loot made it more explicit, right? Because like let's say CryptoPunks came out and they said all the CryptoPunks is just its traits, right? You didn't have the actual pixelated picture that came with it. right? Then people might have perceived it differently, but it wasn't that, right? The CryptoPunks were both the picture and its traits. And loot was just like, people actually just care about the primitive here. And that by making it purely the primitive itself, the characteristics of the item, you invite people to add their own visual layers, to implement it in different things. So it seems to me there's this tension between like, if you make it more open for play, right? You invite it at the same time, but you can probably go too far, right? I think one of the things that Loot did well as well was the concept of the bag or the inventory, right? Because if Loot was something where it was just each NFT was an item, it might have not been that interesting. It might not have invited that much play. It was because you threw a bunch of things together. And I think that if we think about play generally, it's like, I remember being a child, I think like playing in someone's in nature somewhere. The most interesting places to play was also stuff that had several things to work with, right? There's a tree here and a lake, and there's these things over here, these rocks that we can use. But if it was just like, it's like you're in an ocean, it's like it's less to play with. So I think it's like the grouping or categorization is also important, and how you categorize or group things together invites play in different ways. But ultimately, I think, like Paul, you're right. I think it's people are exploring how that looks like, and I think we do tend to get stuck in like gaming as it was before the blockchain came around. And there's still this principle of like the game comes first, and then it's the how do we figure out how to put NFTs or crypto into games. But I think it should be the other way around. You should start with some things that could become various kinds of games in the future. I think there's one person that I follow, Venkatesh Rao. I think he described it well. He said, you start with world building first, and then you invite people to add stories and add games on top of it. And a good example is actually SCP, right? Because SCP, it was just about storytelling, but some people then eventually went and they made an actual video game based on some of the content in the wiki, right? So there was a good example of like, you start with this specific kind of baseline primitive, and then you invite people to participate on top of that. And then in ACP's case was people made a video game based on these various anomalies. So I think you require like a switch around, but that switch around isn't obvious. And I think that's part of what people are exploring at the moment. It's like, what does that look like in practice? And it might be that the kind of games you play isn't what the web, like pre-Web3 games are. It might be different kinds of games. The loot itself might just be play or gameplay in a more traditional sense, where part of the play which is inventing, like role playing, or playing in the backyard as a kid and thinking you're from Star Wars, right? So it's part of that kind of play or gameplay that might be more interesting, that people gravitate towards. And so there's this kind of strange trade-off, like the more real you make it, the more concrete you make it, the more difficult it becomes to invite people to play. And I think that is a tension that will exist because smart contracts are immutable, or generally regarded as immutable. So changing the rules and the protocols, unless you enshrine it in, say, a DAO, is regarded to be set in stone. So the only way to adjust or play with the rules and the boundaries is to fork. But that might be also what's great about it. You kind of also want to invite people to fork because there's this feeling of abundance and so forth. So it requires a rethinking, and I think that's what's very exciting about it. And I think you get a lot of detractors saying like, why would you ever do blockchain gaming? And I think that's exactly an opportunity, not a reason to dismiss this, but an opportunity to like explore.
And Andy, I'm curious if there's anything you wanted to add.
I think that Simon's covered it really well. This notion of having enough in your environments, the rocks, the tree, the lake, as opposed to just a big enough ocean, points at one other feature, which is that the medium in which games take place affects the nature of the boundaries and the ways in which it is possible to play with those boundaries. one of the really challenging features of blockchains in this particular regard as it relates to game design is the fact that it is economic, right? In many other contexts, this is a wonderful thing, but this particular feature then calls up a whole bunch of psychological facts in the game designer's mind, which make it far more difficult to create stories or games of applicability, right? Because what that really means is giving your players or your readers the freedom of interpretation around what money is, around what the economics of your game are about. We're used to being able to carefully define structure and implement internal game economies. It's no longer possible on chain because there is no difference between the internal game economy and the external economy in which it is already operating, right? That particular boundary is made almost entirely permeable on chain just by virtue of the medium in which it exists, as opposed to any particular part of the game which you make. And in the early days of Bitcoin, one of the things that we were constantly asking of traditional finance products in particular was this Latin phrase, cui bono, who benefits, right? In terms of assessing any given system, the key question, particularly of financial systems that one can ask is cui bono, who benefits? Where does the value flow to? And that's a good way to begin assessing the kinds of primitives and the effect that they have on how the system operates. And my suggestion is that in order to create truly applicable games on chain, one has to use the economic facticity of the medium itself as an inherent feature within the game, but one has to use it in the same way that an author of applicability would, which is to make sure that you yourself are not the sole or indeed the majority benefactor of whatever economic play ends up unfolding. And that's really, really difficult to do because we run game studios, we have to fund developers, and we have overheads and expenses and all of these things. But the greatest works of literature often did not end up earning their authors anything. And while I think that is in large part lamentable, and that we can use societal level incentive structures to fix a lot of that kind of feature of how we have organized in the past. I do also think, again, that to make really, really applicable, engaging, and different infinite games in these inherently economic environments is going to require a particular kind of humility and an innovation in how benefits is imagined and played with on chain. It's not enough to do what Axie Infinity is doing. I think, Paul, you and I both know that there are some very serious economic concerns about that particular model with land. And it's in fact a great example of precisely not what I'm talking about. But balancing, as I say, the very real expenses that we have with our other intentions, I know is a difficult thing. But as always, it's do you want to write pulp fiction and earn a good living, or do you want to write a masterpiece which will likely only be recognized as such in 100 years?
Yeah, it's very interesting, and thank you for that, Andy. I think when you discuss that, my mind goes to how you say that a lot of works of art, they're not, I guess, properly recognized yet in terms of economic incentive. But I think the games industry has at least seen a little bit of games that are created not for economic incentive being the ones that succeed. For example, when you look at the genres that come out, I see most of them come from the modding community. For example, like tower defense, like the MOBAs. These all started out as games that were designed by players who just wanted to play together. They didn't think of monetizing all of this, and then that's why I guess they were able to discover these games that people I guess resonate with, like the MOBAs, even like I think like PUBG, like the battle royale genre that started out as a mod also, and it was created by someone who who wasn't from the game industry. Like they were saying that what you're making isn't something that's doable. Like 1 versus 100 people in a game doesn't make sense. And now we have all of these games like Fortnite and all of these other ones that really use that as a template. So yeah, so I think um, I guess when Simon also said forking, that's related to that, right? You should be able to allow people to use what you created and build worlds around it and take it to another direction. So I think mods are a perfect example of that. That people got that finite game and made something infinite out of it. And yeah, and since we're kind of Andy, sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting, I think, is also that the nature of the medium itself is already monetized, right? Like if you look at Vitalik's recent thinking about like how any system that is not actively collusion resistant tends towards the financial, like these systems are already monetized. And what I'm saying is to make like a really, really applicable game on chain, you need to think about the monetized nature in which you're already implicated and then play with that in a way which doesn't allocate benefit to yourself alone and which implements some kind of really interesting mechanic which is deeply aware of this nugget of truth that already monetization is implicit in the medium itself and that interesting things can happen as a result of that. Not wealth generation in the traditional sense, perhaps, but some other. If I knew it, I'd build it. But yes, that's kind of where my thoughts are.
Yeah, maybe someone here will be able to create that. But then maybe I just wanna just go to the last slide. I think it's very relevant to what we've been discussing, and I think it's a magnificent artifact of kernel block 4 also. So this was the declaration of the interdependence of cyberspace. Oops. And then and yeah, I think that it reflects what we want to do in blockchain, I think, of making infinite games. So the declaration was it was a pushback against what Facebook was trying to do around the metaverse. So Jasmine's team was I guess in her words, it was like a wound when Facebook created this. It cut them deeply that they wanted to put this declaration out around how the metaverse shouldn't be defined by just one entity and should be forked by a lot of creators. That's why they coined the term pluriverse in response to the metaverse, and um, and I think it really is a reflection of infinite play as well, right? Wherein if you want the game to continue on, you don't want it to just be defined by what Facebook has wanted it to look like. And I guess that's what I wanted to ask you, Simone and Andy, is what your take is on the declaration, on the metaverse, on how we can build it more purposefully, I would say, as I guess as kernel fellows and also as people who want to create infinite games.
I think I have much to add here. I love that declaration. I completely agree with those principles, and I think it enshrines a lot about what we believe the future should be, and the present for that matter, because we are here. I don't think if you told people 5 years ago that Facebook would change its name to Meta, people would not have believed you. And so suddenly this world is here, and we have to mold the present, but also mold it appropriately for the future. I think one thing about that principle, which I also like, is that part of infinite play is to remember that there are others coming after us. Part of infinite play is to recognize that, we mourn the loss of people and players, but we also celebrate the joy of the people that are yet to come. And so part of our purpose is also to design systems such that we not only play with the people that are present, but also set up play such that people can play into the future. So yeah, I mean, I think we're heading in the right direction, and especially with things like this manifesto and declaration is really great because it recontextualizes the conversation. Web3 is not supposed to be what Facebook thinks the metaverse is going to be, or Meta as it's called now. Yeah, don't have much more to add there.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. And then Andy, curious to hear your thoughts also, of course.
I think that Simon has captured it perfectly. As you know, I love words. These two words, meta and verse. Meta means beyond. Verse, it comes from Old English vers, to plow a line in a field in particular. And I think that it points to what Simon is talking about in terms of infinite play happens not just here, it happens in imaginative dimensions of time. And when we carry with us the notion of like necessary work, it reminds me, the plowing in a field and writing a line, and the fact that they're intimately related, it reminds me of this line from Cyprian Nord. It says, beauty is to prepare us for work, and work is to raise us up. And I think that's one of the features of infinite games, is that they cast this notion of beauty across time, and not extraordinary beauty, the deeply ordinary, the life of Norman, the little face that you saw around the corner that leads to an entire alien world. That there is something about the felt beauty of ordinary moments which extends across time, and which is captured when we are capable of seeing beyond this world into the world that is constantly all around us, like Simon so beautifully said earlier. And also to recall the Sanskrit roots of that word, metta, the compassion, right? Sort of that particular aspect of ourselves through will, intention, courage, and heart expanding into ever wider vistas and verses and fields which exist beyond like right and wrong, but have fundamentally the offering to grow something, right, that will nourish you and sustain generations to come. I think about that a lot, and this document is a wonderful example of that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. And yeah, I guess I just want to thank both you, Simone, and Andy for for this discussion. It actually has expanded my mind a little bit on how we should design games. And I guess I just want to end the discussion before we can have a few more questions if the group has, with how Simone ended one of his blog posts from Dr. Kars's quote. I think this is very, very relevant to us in Kernel, especially with this declaration of the interdependence of cyberspace. I think the word interdependence is the core here. Like it's not about building your own metaverses. It's around the interdependence of what we're all building. And I think that the line that I particularly like here is that it is laughter with others with whom we have discovered that the end we thought were coming to us unexpectedly open. So it's with the people we're designing that that the games will become infinite, I feel. So yeah, so thank you everyone for participating. And yeah, so if we have a few more questions from the Kernel Fellows, then maybe we could take them. If you, Simone and Andy, have a few minutes to stay, of course. Yeah. If anyone has any questions, you can just also unmute.
I've got a question. So Andy, you talked about kind of breaking out from the existing, framework of monetization that already exists in games. So do you think that, part of that will have to be altruistic that will be willing to build games that, we may not see any direct benefit from? Or do you think, given that the nature of crypto is about being able, or part of the nature of crypto is about being able to create incentive structures to incentivize different behavior, there may be a clever solution, that aligns incentives for developers to create infinite games? Because one thing I think about is, specifically in play to earn, one way to think about it is that if you create the largest economic benefit for your players, you actually do benefit more in the long run, because your game will be more popular most likely, and your players will be stickier, and you may get higher royalties over a longer period of time as a result of that. So there kind of can be like a shift to prioritizing the players in that sense, or also in terms of interoperability. The more utility that your in-game assets have and their ability to have uses in other worlds, the larger your economy becomes, and therefore the more valuable your assets are, which ultimately can benefit you as the creator. So I'm just curious kind of what your thoughts are around that, and how that mental shift may take place.
And maybe if you want to take one game as an example, maybe X Infinity, because you were talking that there are some problems using the gaming economics of X Infinity.
Sure. Yeah, Jake, I think it's a great question, and I don't. There's two things to say. The first is that I don't think that it's possible to break with monetization in the blockchain, right? I think that it is inherently a part of the medium itself, which is an extraordinary feature of the medium. Neither good nor bad can be used in both ways. So it's not about breaking with monetization. And I don't necessarily think it's about like altruism in the sense that I understand you to mean it. I think that you're right to move along the lines of aligned incentives in which the entire community is capable of benefiting from infinite or increasingly infinite gameplay. But my question is more fundamental than that. It is, what is the nature of that benefit, right? Like, play to earn is the most simplistic way of using these kinds of media to encourage gameplay. And I think that there are much more interesting and potentially fertile directions if one expands one's perspective of what benefit truly is, and how that might be encouraged, constrained, and secured on chain. That is to say that if you look at the Project Horseshoe piece in Module 5 of the Kernel syllabus, there is this notion that we can play increasingly pro-social games, right? And I think that there is a whole world to be discovered there in terms of what are the kinds of metrics that we can use in these inherently monetized environments, which enable trust, time spent together, time spent talking positively, all of these proxies which we already know point to pro-social behavior, that are inherently tied into the nature of the economy, right? So it's not the number of players using your game. It's not even the number of items or NFTs or the interoperability of them or the land and the price of the land and how it's always going up and how there's no harbinger taxes on it. And it's inevitably going to lead to a housing bubble like you see in any normal economy, which is the whole problem with Axie. It's instead this notion that Rich actually has, right? That like, are there ways, for instance, of when we heal and restore some ecosystem, the token associated with that ecosystem increases in value. Now, are there ways in which we can create games that the more pro-social effects we can demonstrate in the game, the greater the worth of any particular like monetary feature of that game comes to be? I specifically don't use the word token or NFT because I think there are other things that you can also like potentially use for that kind of stuff. But it's that sort of thing that I am trying to kind of hint at, right? Which is not even about like who gets the money. It's much more of, as I sort of have said throughout Kernel, right? Like we're not here to make money. We're here to make money. And my question is always like, are there like increasingly creative and principled ways of making money? And in the world of games, like, yeah, it would be interesting to see how you could use an inherently monetized medium to redefine wealth, to redefine benefits. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really helpful. I did originally, I had misunderstood a little bit around who gets the money. And I think that is a beautiful way of thinking about that. It makes perfect sense in terms of the paradigm shift.
And Simone and Andy, we have a question from Snaps. Snaps, do you want to ask that on camera, or if not, I can ask it?
Sure. So the goal of the Pizza DAO is to make pizza free on planet Earth. And we have so far sold an NFT to accomplish this. We raised like, over $1 million, but we've been thinking really hard about how to build games to incentivize people to participate in this goal. So far, we have the tokenomics of the rare pizza NFT and a pizza token that we would have to design, along these lines to achieve this goal. Maybe there are other ways. I'm just curious how we apply the principles that we've been discussing to this sort of an idea.
Yeah, Andy.
Intentionally. And like using your own discernment, right? I think that's each, like the joy of what you do, Snacks, for me is like, and where I see like a lot of sort of similarities is this thing of like unnecessary features keep the story going and engender surprise. I love Pizza DAO and your take on big mozzarella and all of these like other factors which go along with it, as well as like French cheese, and many of these things are like really deeply delightful. And from that perspective, there is like a lot to be said of the strength lies in the narrative goal, right? Like make pizza free. And I think that there are various different ways of interpreting that, which can lead to sort of infinite games to be played with like whatever economic tools you implement. And like one of the features of Simon's work, which is so exciting to me, is the like open-ended nature of his thinking, that ERC20 tokens, for instance, or indeed NFTs they're a convention, right? And as such, they're incredibly useful for interoperability and for being able to speak some of the languages and be displayed in places where people can find them and in which they're legible and all of these things which are necessary. But like, don't forget that they're conventions, right? And that you can do whatever you want with these things, like especially if you've implemented like the base layer that adheres to the standard and which is interoperable with the places that you need it to be legible in, then you can, like, the world is open for play, right? There are so many things that you can do with a publicly accessible ABI, and I don't want to say what those things are, because A, I don't know because I'm an idiot, and B, it would be like dogmatic and coercive. And the insight for me is that the real infinite game is already Ethereum, right? Or environments like it. And that's, like, all of these conventions are very, very useful, but they can be played with. It begins in the narrative. And I think that you have like a really surprisingly delightful accessible, understandable, and universal narrative with pizza. I mean, it genuinely surprises me, but it's incredible. And that as long as you don't get stuck in the trap of thinking that the USD representation of your token's worth or the NFT's worth is the reason d'etre of your thing, then you should be fine, right? The one other thing that I'll say on this is that, like, it's inane to me that people on Twitter will put a $ before their token symbol. I understand that it has, you know, impacts in terms of it's a ticker symbol, and then you can like group content under it, much like you can a hashtag. But that's Twitter's fault, right? And you're playing into their particular and very finite game. These tokens are meant to disassemble large parts of the fiat narrative, and to put a $ like before your token, it's just, it blows my mind because it is like the opposite of this kind of open-ended narrative play that we've been talking about today. So yeah, if you like avoid those traps, right, which lead you to dead ends, and use this like delightfully surprising narrative that you have to engender experiments with your token. You know, encourage people to program stuff with it, to like put together a curve for their franchise, or to rip off Simon's Neolastics, or, you know, like do something, you know, make a Neolastic pizza, you know, use the token, it's wonderful, that kind of stuff. But if you have that as a part of your culture, that could probably help a lot. I don't know if that's useful.
I actually like the idea of like making pizzas of stuff that exist in Ethereum. It's like the equivalent of like making t-shirts of brands, but it's just make pizzas of stuff that exists in Ethereum.
In defense of the $ convention, I mean, not everything is tradable. So to really pithily describe that a certain thing can be bought, can be exchanged, how else do you do it besides putting a $ on the front of it? Or, I mean, when you're writing.
You don't use Twitter is the short answer to that. And yes, it's a trade-off. It's absolutely a trade-off. And don't get me wrong, Stacks, I'm an idealist. And not everything that I say will be applicable to everyone. That's you know, as they say, that this is a hill that I will gladly die on.
As you were talking about, I guess experiments, Andy, I think I was just in the public goods discussion group also, and when I think Griff he created the token engineering commons, right? I think Snacks, something that might be worth taking a look at is how they're doing that, and of course I've heard that Olympus DAO might be a good model to take a look at from some of the kernel folks I've talked to. So maybe just in terms of tokenomic design, I know it's more like, I guess, simpler steps versus what Andy and Simone talked about, but that's what I would do, at least. And yeah, do we have one more question? Yeah, exactly. I just found out what that was anyway. Well, okay. Well, if we don't
I have to run.
Yeah, if you don't have any questions, thank you, Simone and Andy. It was I guess a really great way to end the kernel block. And so we hope to, I guess, Simone, we hope to see you soon again. And Andy, of course,
Yeah, thank you.
we'll see you on the end of kernel block 4. But thank you for helping us think more about infinite games, and yeah, hopefully we'll share a few games that we've created with you, and you'll see that we've applied what we've learned here.
I always enjoy these discussions. It's a nice community, so thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you all soon.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah. Stop sharing. Stop recording.